The cold night air hung heavy in the city as streetlights flickered and the sound of distant traffic echoed through the empty streets. It was a night like any other, or so it seemed. But sometimes, the most ordinary moments can turn into something extraordinary, something that will change the course of a person's life forever. On this particular night, a young boy found himself standing at the intersection of fear and hope, caught in a situation he never could have imagined. He was just walking home, minding his business, when he suddenly found himself surrounded by flashing red and blue lights. The screech of tires on the asphalt cut through the silence, and within moments, a police officer was stepping out of his cruiser. The boy's heart raced in his chest, his mind spinning with confusion. He hadn't done anything wrong. He knew that. So why was the officer approaching him with such suspicion in his eyes? The officer's hand rested on the holster of his gun, his eyes scanning the boy with a look that made him feel small, exposed, as though his very existence was under question. The young boy swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. "Hey, you!" the officer barked, his voice sharp, cutting through the air. "What are you doing out here?" The boy took a step back, instinctively trying to make himself as small as possible, though he knew it wouldn't help. The officer's presence was overpowering. "I'm just walking home," the boy muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know the curfew, don't you?" The officer pressed, his eyes narrowing. "You should be home by now. This is a bad part of town, especially for someone like you." The boy's stomach dropped at the words. He had heard stories of encounters like this, seen them on the news, and now he was living it. The officer's tone wasn't just questioning, it was accusatory, like the boy had already been found guilty of something he hadn't even done. His skin felt hot, his palms sweaty, but he kept his composure. He knew that losing his temper or showing fear could make everything worse. "I'm just trying to get home," the boy said again, trying to keep his voice steady. But the officer wasn't listening. Instead, he stepped closer, his posture growing more aggressive. "I don't like your attitude," the officer said, his voice low and menacing. "You don't belong out here. You got any idea what could happen to you, walking around these streets late at night?" The boy's heart pounded. He could feel the officer's breath on his face, could see the hatred burning in his eyes. He tried to step back, but the officer grabbed his arm, yanking him forward. The grip was tight, unforgiving. "I said I'm just walking home," the boy protested, his voice shaking. But the officer was beyond reason. With one swift motion, he pulled out his handcuffs and snapped them onto the boy's wrists. The cold metal bit into the boy's skin, sending a shiver down his spine. This wasn't happening. He wasn't supposed to be arrested. He hadn't done anything wrong. But the officer wasn't listening. He was already pushing the boy toward the squad car, his grip unrelenting. As they approached the car, something strange happened. The boy, in a desperate attempt to break free from the tension, spoke without thinking. It was a name, just a simple name, but it had the power to stop the officer dead in his tracks. "My dad is your boss," the boy said, his voice calm but firm. It was a sentence that didn't make sense. It wasn't something he'd planned to say. But in that moment, it felt like the only thing that could change everything. The officer's movements froze, his hands still clutching the boy's arm, his entire body stiffening as though the words had physically paralyzed him. The boy felt a flicker of hope. Could this be it? Was there a way out of this? For a long moment, there was only silence. The officer stood still, his jaw clenched, his eyes searching the boy's face as though he had just heard something he couldn't quite process. The boy knew it wasn't a typical statement. It wasn't something that would come up in most confrontations. But the truth was undeniable. His father wasn't just any man. He was someone who held a position of power, someone with influence. And suddenly, the officer seemed to realize the weight of those words. The officer's hand slowly released its grip on the boy's arm. His eyes flicked nervously toward the squad car, then back to the boy. For a split second, it seemed like the officer was trying to decide what to do next. The tension was thick, the air heavy with anticipation. What would the officer do? Would he listen? Would he back down? The boy's mind raced, knowing that the next few seconds could determine everything. He could feel the officer's eyes on him, the judgment, the uncertainty. Then, just as quickly as the moment had come, it passed. The officer took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing, and with one swift motion, he shoved the boy toward the side of the car. You think I care who your father is? The officer sneered, his voice suddenly full of bitterness. It doesn't matter who he is. You're under arrest. The boy's stomach churned. He knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot. He was still in trouble, still at the mercy of this man, and nothing was going to change that easily. But the officer's reaction, his hesitation, told the boy one thing: the power of that name had shaken him, even if just for a moment. The boy tried to pull himself together, to push through the fear and the anger building up inside him. He couldn't back down now. He couldn't let this officer think he could intimidate him just because of who he was. But what came next was even more shocking than what had happened before. The officer hesitated once more, his eyes darting to the boy's face. For a moment, it seemed like the officer was second-guessing everything: his actions, his choices, even his role in the whole situation. But then something in his expression changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Get in the car, the officer ordered, his voice now shaking with something other than anger, perhaps fear, perhaps doubt. The boy didn't know what had caused the shift, but he wasn't about to question it. As he was pushed into the back of the squad car, his mind was still racing, still processing what had just happened. What did the officer know? Was he really starting to realize the boy's father was someone important, someone with enough power to make this whole situation disappear? But before the boy could get too lost in his thoughts, the door slammed shut, cutting off his line of thinking. The cold, sterile smell of the police car filled his nose as he sat there, his wrists still bound by the handcuffs, wondering what would happen next. Would the officer relent? Would the boy's father be able to intervene? Or would this just be the beginning of a much bigger problem? As the squad car pulled away, the boy felt a chill run through him, but not from the cold. It was the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much more complicated than he could have ever imagined. And no matter how hard he tried to make sense of it, one question lingered in his mind: how much power did his father truly have, and how far would it go to protect him? The boy didn't know it yet, but the coming days would reveal just how deep this story really ran and how one simple, offhand comment could change everything. Tob continued. The car rumbled forward, the tires grinding against the pavement, and the boy sat silently in the back, his mind reeling. His heart was still pounding from the moment he had tried to break free with that one sentence, the words "My dad is your boss," echoing in his head. He couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play, something he couldn't fully understand yet. But deep down, he also knew that the officer's hesitation, that brief moment of uncertainty, wasn't just a coincidence. His father's name was well known, but it wasn't just fame that gave him power. It was the kind of power that could make people stop in their tracks, reassess their actions, and sometimes, just sometimes, make them reconsider their choices. He hadn't meant to bring his father into the situation, not like that. It had just slipped out in desperation, a last-ditch attempt to try to break free from the officer's grip. But now, as the car sped down the dimly lit streets, he couldn't help but wonder if that slip of the tongue would come back to haunt him. He turned his head slightly, glancing through the tiny barred window between the back seat and the front. The officer was driving, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, but the boy could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly. It was clear the officer wasn't as sure of himself anymore. There was something in the air, a sense of unease that hadn't been there before. The boy had seen it in other situations, in the way people suddenly grew nervous when they realized they were out of their depth, when they understood they might have made a mistake. The boy's mind raced as he tried to piece together what had just happened. His father, his powerful father, the one who held a position of authority in the city, had always warned him to stay out of trouble, to be careful in situations like this. But it wasn't just the police he had to be cautious of. It was the kind of power that could get someone into trouble just by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The boy knew this world all too well. He had grown up in it, seen it, felt it, lived it. His father's influence stretched far and wide, touching nearly every aspect of life in the city. People feared him, respected him, but they also resented him. Power like his came with a price, and that price wasn't always money, it was trust, loyalty, and sometimes control. The boy had always lived in the shadow of that power, always aware of the expectations placed on him. But now, it felt like that power was staring him straight in the face. It wasn't abstract anymore, it wasn't just something he read about in the papers or heard whispered about in hushed tones at family gatherings. It was real. And it was in this car, driving down the dark streets with him trapped in the back seat. As the officer turned down a side road, the boy glanced out of the window. The city seemed so different at night. The streets that had been busy and bustling during the day were now empty, desolate. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional distant siren. The boy's eyes lingered on the buildings as they passed, tall, silent structures that seemed to loom in the darkness, their windows staring blankly back at him. It was strange how something as ordinary as a city could suddenly feel so foreign, so intimidating. The officer didn't say a word as they drove, but the tension between them was palpable. The boy could feel the weight of the officer's gaze every so often, but when their eyes met, the officer quickly looked away, as if he couldn't handle the thought of what those simple words might mean. The boy tried to calm his nerves. He knew he needed to think carefully now. One wrong move, one slip of the tongue, and the whole situation could spiral out of control. After what felt like an eternity, the officer finally pulled the car to a stop in front of a small, nondescript building. It looked like any other office building in the city, but there was something about it that made the boy's stomach twist. He didn't recognize it, and he had a feeling that he wasn't supposed to. "Out," the officer muttered, his voice still rough, barely above a whisper. The boy didn't protest. He couldn't. His heart was still racing, his mind in a haze, as he stepped out of the car and stood on the cold pavement. The officer didn't say anything else. Instead, he motioned for the boy to follow him, leading him toward the building. The door to the building creaked open, and they stepped inside. The air was musty, stale, like it hadn't been opened in years. The boy's eyes quickly adjusted to the dim light as they walked down a narrow hallway. The walls were bare, the floor slick with dust. Everything about the place felt wrong, out of place. The officer didn't stop. He didn't even glance back at the boy. It was as though the boy had become a ghost, an afterthought, someone to be dealt with and forgotten. But the boy couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The officer's earlier hesitation, his sudden change in behavior, had planted a seed of doubt in the boy's mind. What did it all mean? What was really going on behind the scenes? They reached a door at the end of the hallway, and the officer opened it without a word. Inside was a small, dimly lit room, filled with outdated furniture and old filing cabinets. The only thing that stood out was the desk at the far end, where a single figure sat, hunched over a stack of papers. The officer stepped inside, and the boy followed, his legs feeling heavier with each step. The figure at the desk didn't look up, didn't even acknowledge their presence, but the boy could feel the weight of the room shift as soon as the officer closed the door behind them. It was the silence that hit him first, the kind of silence that spoke louder than any words could. The boy stood there, uncertain of what to do, waiting for the moment to pass, waiting for anyone to break the stillness. Finally, the figure at the desk spoke, his voice low, almost too soft to hear. "You brought him here?" The officer nodded, but his movements were stiff, almost hesitant. I didn't know what else to do. He said his dad was. The figure cut him off with a sharp gesture. I know who his dad is, he said, his tone dismissive. And I know what this means. The boy felt a chill crawl up his spine. He wasn't sure who this person was, but the way the officer acted around him made it clear that this wasn't just any ordinary encounter. This was something deeper, something more complicated than he could have imagined. The figure stood up from behind the desk, and for the first time, the boy got a good look at him. He was tall, with graying hair and sharp features that gave him an almost predatory look. His eyes, however, were the most unsettling thing about him, cold, calculating, as though he were constantly evaluating everyone around him. You have no idea what you've just done, do you? The figure asked, his voice taking on a new edge. The boy felt a lump form in his throat. I didn't mean don't, the figure interrupted, waving his hand. You've already said enough? The boy was about to speak again, to explain himself, but something in the figure's gaze made him pause. It was a look that said nothing yet said everything. The boy had no idea what was going to happen next, but he could feel that his life had just taken a turn into something far more dangerous than he could have ever anticipated. He tried to steady his breathing, but the weight of the situation was too much. Everything he thought he understood about his father, about the world around him, was suddenly called into question. How much did he really know? How far did his father's influence stretch? And more importantly, who were these people in front of him, and why did they seem so calm? The officer, who had been standing in the corner of the room, suddenly spoke again. What do we do with him now? The figure at the desk didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to a nearby window and looked out, his back turned to the boy. The silence that followed felt suffocating, like the calm before a storm. Finally, the figure turned back, his expression unreadable. You'll take him home, he said coldly. But remember this next time, we won't be so lenient. The boy's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what that meant, but he knew he wasn't going to like it. The officer nodded and motioned for the boy to follow him. As they left the room and walked back down the hallway, the boy couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. There was more to this story than he could see, more layers he hadn't even begun to uncover. And the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous it seemed. The city outside felt just as empty as before, but the boy knew one thing for sure: his life was never going to be the same again. The car ride back home felt like a blur. The city outside seemed darker than ever, its silent streets echoing the growing unease that had settled in the pit of the boy's stomach. The officer didn't say a word, and the boy didn't dare break the silence. Every part of his body felt on edge, as if any wrong movement could set something off. His thoughts were racing, trying to process everything that had happened: the encounter with the officer, the strange building, the figure behind the desk with his cold eyes, and most of all, his father's name. What was really going on? The boy couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled into something much larger than he had ever realized. Something involving his father, something that was dangerous. His father had always told him to stay out of trouble, to avoid the kind of situations that would put him in harm's way. But that was before the boy had known the full extent of what his father was really involved in. The officer had seemed hesitant, even scared, when the boy mentioned his father. That brief moment of uncertainty had rattled him. Was the officer just scared of losing his job? Or was there something more to it? Maybe the boy had inadvertently stumbled onto something bigger, something his father had worked hard to keep hidden. The boy didn't know who to trust anymore. Everyone seemed to have their own agenda, and he was stuck in the middle, caught between what he knew and what he feared. As the car turned down his street, the boy felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. They were so close now, so close to home. The familiar sights of his neighborhood should have offered some comfort, but instead, they only heightened the tension. He could feel the eyes of every street lamp, the shadow of every tree, watching him, waiting for something to happen. The officer finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "Get out," he said as the car came to a stop in front of the boy's house. There was no warmth in his tone, just a harsh command. The boy hesitated, glancing toward the officer, but didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what was left to say. The tension that had been building since he was first stopped was still there, hanging in the air like a storm about to break. The boy opened the door and stepped out, his legs shaking as he walked toward the front door of his house. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of everything he didn't understand, everything he feared was pushing down on him. Before he could reach the door, he heard the officer's voice one more time. "Don't talk about this," the officer called out. "Not to anyone. You understand?" The boy nodded, but his mind was a blur. He barely heard the officer drive off, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. He was standing there, on his doorstep, feeling more alone than he ever had before. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and immediately his mother appeared in the hallway, her expression filled with concern. She hadn't heard the car pull up, she must have been waiting for him. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice shaky. "What happened?" The boy opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. He wanted to tell her everything, to explain why he'd been out so late, why the police had stopped him. But a part of him, an instinctual, fearful part, told him to stay quiet. He didn't know how much of the truth he should share, how much he should reveal. The encounter had already shaken him to his core, and he wasn't sure if he could trust anyone with what had just happened. His mother took a step toward him, her hand reaching out, but she must have sensed something was wrong. "What is it? What's going on?" "I'm fine, Mom," he said, his voice sounding hollow. "I'm just tired." She didn't seem convinced, but she didn't push any further. "Well, get some rest. We'll talk in the morning." The boy nodded, but as he made his way up the stairs, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. His room felt different now. It wasn't a sanctuary anymore. The walls that once offered him safety and comfort now seemed to close in around him. He felt trapped. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, the boy couldn't stop thinking about the events of the night. The officer's behavior. The cold man in the office. The unease that had crept into the room with every word that had been spoken. He had known his father was involved in things that weren't always good, but this felt different. There was a sense of danger in the air now, a tension that he couldn't ignore. He wanted to understand more, but part of him was terrified of what he might find. Was this the world his father had built? And if so, how deep did it go? The boy's mind kept circling back to that one simple truth: his father had power. But how much power? And what had his father done to get it? He tried to push the thoughts aside and drift to sleep, but it was impossible. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside his window, made his heart race. He couldn't escape the feeling that something was coming, something he couldn't avoid. The next morning, the boy's mother woke him with a soft knock on his door. "Breakfast is ready," she called through the door. Her voice was warm, comforting, but it didn't reach him the way it used to. He got out of bed slowly, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to him. As he sat at the table for breakfast, his mother made small talk, asking about school, about his friends, about anything that might take his mind off the night before. But the boy could barely focus. Every word felt like it came from a distant place. His thoughts were elsewhere, on the officer, on the mysterious man in the office, on the tension that had filled the air when the words "my dad is your boss" had left his mouth. The boy didn't know how much longer he could keep pretending everything was fine. He didn't know if he could hold it together long enough to understand what had really happened, what was going on behind the scenes. But he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't sit idly by and wait for whatever was coming next. The feeling of being trapped was growing stronger, suffocating him. He needed answers. He needed to know the truth, no matter what it cost. The day dragged on, But nothing happened, at least, nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. His mother went about her usual routine, busying herself with household chores, but the boy could see the worry in her eyes. She was asking all the right questions but never quite getting to the heart of the issue. She didn't know, and he couldn't bring himself to tell her. Later that afternoon, as he was sitting alone in his room, there was a knock at the door. He froze. It wasn't his mother. It wasn't anyone he expected. He stood up, his heart racing, and slowly walked toward the door. The knob turned, and he opened it, his pulse pounding in his ears. Standing in the doorway was a figure he didn't recognize. A man dressed in a dark suit, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. His eyes were hard, cold eyes that seemed to be searching for something, and the boy realized with a sinking feeling that it was him. They were looking for him. "You need to come with me," the man said, his voice flat, without emotion. The boy's breath caught in his throat. This was it. The moment he had been dreading. What now? What had his father gotten him into? Before he could respond, the man stepped forward, his presence filling the doorway, pushing the boy back into the room. The boy stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest as the man stepped closer. The figure in the doorway didn't look like a typical intruder. His dark suit, polished shoes, and unruffled appearance gave him an air of authority, of someone who wasn't just here for a simple conversation. The cold, calculating look in his eyes sent a shiver down the boy's spine. This wasn't just about a warning anymore. This was something much bigger. "Who are you?" the boy asked, his voice barely a whisper. His hands trembled at his sides, and he could feel his pulse throbbing in his throat. Every instinct told him to run, but where could he go? He had no idea who this man was, and for all he knew, the officer who had left him alone could still be watching from somewhere, hidden in the shadows. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped further into the room, his shoes making no sound on the floor. His eyes scanned the boy like a predator eyeing its prey, calculating, analyzing every detail. Then, as if he'd made up his mind, the man took a step forward and spoke again, his voice low, measured. "Your father has made enemies. Powerful enemies. And they don't take kindly to people like you." The words hit the boy like a punch to the stomach. His father, his dad, had always been a figure of strength, someone who had control over everything around him. But this man was suggesting something else, something darker. His father had enemies? Was that why the officer had been so shaken last night? Was that why the mysterious man in the office had acted with such authority? Enemies? The boy tried to sound brave, but the doubt in his voice was unmistakable. He couldn't deny the rising fear inside him. "What are you talking about?" "My dad, he's a powerful man. He's not afraid of anyone." The man's lips curled into a slight, almost imperceptible smile, one that made the boy's blood run cold. "You still don't get it, do you? Your father may be powerful, but power is not the only thing that matters. There are forces at play that even your father can't control." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And now you're caught in the middle." The boy's mind raced. Everything he thought he understood about his family, about the world around him, was being turned upside down. His father's power, which had always seemed like an impenetrable shield, now seemed more like a trap. The boy's chest tightened as a sick realization crept into his thoughts. This wasn't just a case of a rogue officer or some minor misunderstanding. This was much more complicated, much more dangerous. "I don't know what you're talking about," the boy said, trying to regain some sense of control, but his voice trembled despite his best efforts. The man didn't reply immediately. He just stood there, watching him, calculating. Finally, he spoke again, his words sending a chill through the boy's entire body. "You don't need to know yet. But soon you will. When your father's enemies come for him, you'll be the one they look for." You'll be the one they use. And it won't just be your father they target. It'll be you. Your life is about to change forever. The boy felt his legs weaken, his breath coming faster now. His mind raced, the implications of what the man was saying slowly sinking in. His father's enemies? Who were they? What kind of people had his father pissed off? And what did this man want from him? Why was he standing here, in the boy's room, saying these cryptic words? The room suddenly felt too small, too suffocating. The boy wanted to shout for his mother, to run to her and tell her everything, but something told him that wouldn't do any good. This man wasn't here for a simple conversation, and anyone who could walk into his home with such ease was not someone to be trifled with. The man seemed to sense the boy's rising panic, and for a moment, his expression softened just enough to make the boy think he might finally break the silence and explain himself. But then the smile faded, and the coldness returned to his eyes. "You're not ready to know everything yet," he said, his voice now flat, almost bored. "But soon you will be. When the time comes, when everything starts to unravel, you'll have a choice to make. And I suggest you make the right one." The boy's heart pounded in his ears as the man turned toward the door. Just as he reached for the handle, he paused. "One more thing," the man said, glancing back at the boy. His eyes were sharp, focused. "If you think you can hide from what's coming, think again. There's nowhere you can run. And no one can protect you, not even your father." Before the boy could respond, the man was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. The house was silent once again, but the boy's mind was anything but still. His hands were shaking, his breath coming in short bursts as he tried to process what had just happened. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath him, like everything he knew about his life was suddenly up for grabs. He staggered back to his bed, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm. What had that man meant? Who were these enemies, and what did they want with him? And how much of his father's world had he not understood? His father had always been so careful to shield him from the darker sides of life, but now it was clear that those dark sides had come crashing into his world. The boy's mind flashed back to the events of the previous night, the officer's hesitation, the coldness of the figure in the office, and that haunting moment when he'd said those words, "My dad is your boss." It had felt like a desperate plea, a way to get out of a bad situation. But now, it seemed like a catalyst, like it had set something in motion that he couldn't control. The tension in the house was suffocating, but the boy didn't know what to do. He couldn't talk to his mother, not yet. She wouldn't understand. She would worry, and he wasn't ready to explain. He didn't even understand it himself. But the fear gnawing at him now was different. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was the fear that something terrible was coming, something he couldn't stop, no matter how hard he tried. Suddenly, the boy's phone buzzed, breaking the silence. His heart skipped a beat as he glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number, but there was no mistaking the urgency that pulsed through him. He hesitated before answering, his finger hovering over the screen. What if it was the man from earlier? What if it was someone else, someone with more questions? More threats? He took a deep breath and swiped to answer. "Hello?" A voice on the other end was quiet, strained. "I don't have much time," it said. "But you need to listen to me carefully. Your father's enemies are already making their move. If you want to survive this, you need to get out of there now." The boy's blood ran cold as the voice continued, a sense of urgency in every word. This wasn't just a warning. It was a call to action. And the boy knew deep down that his world was about to be shattered. The phone call ended abruptly, leaving nothing but the echo of the words hanging in the air. And just like that, the boy was left standing at the edge of a precipice, looking into the darkness below, knowing that he had no choice but to take the leap. The boy's heart was pounding in his chest as the phone call ended. The voice on the other end had been frantic, and it was clear from the urgency that something huge was about to go down. The man who had visited his room earlier, the one who had spoken about enemies and threats, had been right. His father's enemies weren't waiting, they were making their move. He didn't know what they were after, but he was sure it had something to do with his family, his father's world, and now him. The boy's head was spinning. What should he do now? He had to move fast, but where could he go? He couldn't go to the police. Not after what had happened the night before. The officer's strange behavior, the man in the office, none of it made sense. Everything was connected in ways he didn't understand, and he didn't know if he could trust anyone. But one thing was clear: if he stayed here, he wouldn't be safe. He grabbed his jacket, pulling it on quickly as his mind raced. His room felt like a prison now, a place that couldn't protect him anymore. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like it was closing in around him. He glanced out the window, looking at the familiar street below, but it all felt distant, like he was seeing it for the first time. The world outside was no longer the same. He moved quietly, his footsteps barely making a sound as he went downstairs. His mother was in the kitchen, her back to him, humming softly as she prepared dinner. The boy stood in the hallway for a moment, watching her, his thoughts a tangled mess. He wanted to tell her everything, to explain why they had to leave, why they couldn't stay here anymore. But the words caught in his throat. How could he explain what he didn't fully understand himself? How could he tell her that their lives had been turned upside down, that they were in danger, and that it was all connected to his father's mysterious past? He looked at the front door. He knew what he had to do. He had to leave. If he stayed, it wouldn't be just him at risk, it would be her too. Taking a deep breath, the boy made his decision. He stepped toward the front door, his fingers brushing against the handle. His heart skipped a beat as he heard a voice behind him. "Where are you going?" His mother's voice was soft but laced with concern. She had turned around, her eyes searching his face, sensing that something was wrong. The boy froze, his hands still on the door. He hadn't planned on her noticing. He didn't want to involve her. I'm just going out for a bit," he lied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll be back soon." But his mother didn't look convinced. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why are you acting like this? Where's the urgency?" The boy could feel the walls closing in, and he knew that whatever he said, it wouldn't make things any easier. His mother was smart, she would figure it out eventually, but not yet. Not now. He couldn't let her see the fear in his eyes. "I'll explain later," he said, his voice tight. "Just trust me, Mom. Please. I have to go." His mother stepped closer, her eyes wide with worry. "No, you can't just leave like this. I don't care what's going on, I need to know what's happening." "I need to." Before she could finish, the boy spun around, his hand on the door again. "I can't tell you everything right now. I just need to go." His mother hesitated, and for a split second, the boy thought she might stop him, pull him back inside. But then something in her face shifted. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, the desperation he couldn't hide. Maybe it was the realization that something was terribly wrong. Whatever it was, she stepped back, letting him go. "Be careful," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet fear. "Please. Come back to me." The boy nodded, his throat tight, and without another word, he stepped out into the night. The cold air hit him like a wave as he walked down the street, his footsteps echoing in the empty quiet. His mind was reeling. Where would he go? Who could he trust? He couldn't go to his father, not now. Not with everything he had just learned. And even if he could, what good would it do? His father had made enemies, powerful ones. He'd warned him, in his own way, that the boy would soon be in their crosshairs. The boy turned the corner, heading towards the park. He needed to think, to process. But just as he crossed the street, his phone buzzed again. It was a message. No number. Just a string of cryptic words. They're already here. Don't trust anyone. Not even him. His stomach dropped. He knew exactly who him referred to. The officer. The one who had hesitated, the one who had frozen when the boy had mentioned his father. He had been part of the picture from the beginning, but now he realized the officer was not someone to rely on. No one could be trusted. Not anymore. Panic gripped him as he stood there in the street, feeling like the walls were closing in. He was running out of options. And just as that thought crossed his mind, the sound of a car engine roared to life in the distance. The boy's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the sound. He could feel the tension building again, like something big was about to happen. The car came into view, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The boy took a few steps back, his instincts screaming at him to run, to hide. But it was too late. The car pulled up beside him, and the door swung open. "Get in," a voice called from inside. It was the officer. The same officer who had been so cold, so distant. But now there was a different urgency in his voice, a note of desperation. The boy hesitated. This was it. The moment he had feared. He knew this was no coincidence. The officer knew more than he had let on. And if the message was true, if this man could no longer be trusted, it could be a trap. But then, the officer spoke again, his voice softer, more urgent. "Listen to me. You don't have time. They know where you are. Get in the car. Now." The boy's mind raced. Was this really a trap, or was it his only way out? Could he trust the officer, or was he being manipulated again? With no time to think, no time to make a choice, the boy did the only thing he could. He got in the car. As the car sped off into the night, the boy tried to focus, tried to understand what was happening, but everything was happening too fast. His thoughts were a blur of confusion and fear. He had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was clear: his world had just shattered, and there was no turning back. And then, as they rounded a corner, the officer looked at him, and the boy saw something in his eyes that he hadn't expected. A flash of recognition. "You don't know everything yet," the officer said, his voice tinged with regret. "But you will soon. Just trust me." The boy's stomach twisted as the officer pulled a sharp turn down an unfamiliar road. Whatever was happening, whatever was about to unfold, it was bigger than anything he could have imagined. And just when he thought the worst was behind him, he felt the chilling realization that the twist he never saw coming was already unfolding, and he was caught right in the middle. The car raced through the night, its tires screeching as the officer navigated the winding roads with a speed that left the boy breathless. The boy had no idea where they were going, but he couldn't stop himself from glancing over his shoulder, wondering if someone was following them. His mind was spinning, trying to piece together everything that had happened so far: the man who had visited him, the officer's strange behavior, and the cryptic messages warning him to trust no one. The officer was silent, his grip tight on the steering wheel, his eyes flicking back to the road as he drove. The boy wanted to speak, to ask him what was going on, but the words felt stuck in his throat. Every question he had seemed to lead to more confusion, more uncertainty. After what felt like an eternity, the officer slowed the car, pulling off onto a deserted street lined with old buildings. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the pavement. The car stopped in front of a large, nondescript building that looked like it had been abandoned for years. "Get out," the officer ordered, his voice low and steady. "We need to talk." The boy hesitated. This wasn't what he had expected. He had no idea where he was or why they had stopped, but something about the officer's tone told him that this was where he needed to be. He opened the door and stepped out, his legs unsteady as he followed the officer into the building. Inside, the air was cold, musty. The walls were bare, and the flickering overhead lights gave the place an eerie, almost forgotten feeling. The boy's heart raced, but he didn't ask questions. He knew that this was the moment where everything would finally be explained, where the answers would come, even if they were hard to hear. The officer led him through a maze of empty rooms until they reached a small office at the back of the building. The man who sat behind the desk was unfamiliar, but there was something about him that made the boy's stomach tighten. This man didn't look like an officer, he looked like someone who belonged in a place like this, someone who operated in the shadows. "Sit down," the officer said, gesturing to the chair across from the desk. The boy obeyed, feeling the weight of the situation press down on him. The man behind the desk didn't speak immediately. He simply studied the boy for a long moment, his eyes calculating, cold. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. "You're wondering why you're here, aren't you?" he asked, his voice sharp and direct. The boy nodded, though he wasn't sure what he expected in return. He had so many questions, so many things he needed to understand, but he was too overwhelmed to ask them all at once. "Your father has been a key figure in a much larger game," the man continued, his voice smooth but heavy with significance. "A game that you didn't even know existed. For years, he's been working with people who operate in the shadows, people who control things you wouldn't believe. But your father made a mistake. A big one." The boy's heart dropped. His father had made a mistake? All of his life, he had been told that his father was untouchable, that he had control over everything. But now, this man was saying that his father had made a mistake that was now catching up with him. "What mistake?" the boy asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man behind the desk leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the surface of the desk rhythmically as he considered the question. "Your father betrayed someone. Someone powerful. Someone who doesn't forgive betrayal easily. And now, they want revenge. Not just on your father, but on anyone connected to him." The boy's mind raced. Betrayal? Who had his father betrayed? And why did this have to do with him? He wasn't part of his father's world. He didn't know anything about the darker side of his father's life, and he certainly didn't ask for any of this. The officer, who had been standing silently beside the desk, finally spoke. "This is bigger than both of you. And if you're not careful, you'll be caught in the crossfire." The boy felt a chill run down his spine. He had been caught in the middle of something dangerous, something far beyond his control. He had thought that his life was simple, he had thought that everything would always stay the same. But now, he understood that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The world his father lived in wasn't the world he had known, and now he was paying the price for it. "So, what do I do now?" the boy asked, his voice shaky. "What am I supposed to do?" The man behind the desk sighed, as though the answer was something he had been expecting. "You survive," he said. "You lay low, you keep your head down, and you don't trust anyone. Not even the people who claim to be on your side." The boy felt the weight of the words sink in. There was no escaping it. He was caught in a game that was much larger than he had ever imagined, and now he had to find a way to survive it. But how? How could he escape the reach of the people who were after him? "You're not alone," the officer said suddenly, his voice softer now. "There are others who can help you. People who owe your father favors. People who still believe in what he did, in what he stood for." The boy looked up at the officer, his gaze filled with confusion. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice raw with emotion. "You don't owe me anything. You don't owe my father anything." The officer's expression hardened, but for a moment, there was a flicker of something else, something more human. "Because I understand what it's like to be caught in a situation you didn't ask for. I've been where you are, and I know how it feels to want answers. To want out. But sometimes there is no out. You just have to fight through it." The boy didn't know what to say to that. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to be part of this world, to live in the shadow of the mistakes his father had made. But there was no escaping it. He had no choice now. Are you ready to hear what comes next? The man behind the desk asked, his voice steady. The boy nodded slowly. He didn't know what was coming, but he had no choice but to face it. The game had already begun, and he was already a player. We have a plan, the man said. A way to stop what's coming. But it won't be easy. There will be sacrifices, risks. And you'll have to make difficult choices. But if you want to survive, if you want to make sure your father's enemies don't win, you need to be prepared for anything. The boy's mind raced. He didn't know if he could do this. He didn't know if he was ready. But there was no turning back now. His father's world had collided with his own, and now he had to deal with the fallout. I'm in, he said quietly. He didn't know what that meant yet, but he knew that if he wanted to survive, he had to fight. The man behind the desk smiled, a cold, calculating smile that didn't reach his eyes. Good. You'll need all the strength you can muster. But remember, this is only the beginning. As the boy stood up to leave the room, he felt a sense of finality settle over him. The pieces of his life were falling into place, but they were falling into a pattern he hadn't chosen. His life would never be the same. And as he stepped out into the night once again, he realized that he wasn't just running from his father's mistakes. He was running towards something far more dangerous, something that could change everything he thought he knew. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel afraid. Whatever was coming, he was ready.